They told her she was barren the same way people talked about broken tools, with quiet embarrassment and a hint of relief that the flaw was no longer theirs to manage. And Mara learned early that silence was safer than protest, because in her family, silence meant survival, and survival meant staying useful just long enough not to be thrown away. She had been 16 when the village healer shook her head, 20 when her father stopped meeting her eyes, and 24 when her mother finally said the words out loud as if naming the curse would make it lighter to carry. No man would want a woman who couldn't give him children, and in that moment, Mara understood she had already been sold long before money ever changed hands. The years that followed blurred into labor and obedience, dawn to dusk work that hardened her hands and dulled her voice, while whispers followed her like shadows, barren, empty, wasted. And every whispered word carved something out of her until she learned how to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. When the proposal came, it wasn't announced with celebration or hope, but with negotiation. Like livestock being priced by weight and utility, and Mara sat in the corner listening as her father discussed her worth with men, who never once asked her name. The rancher was a widower, older, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and grief, living far from the village on land, so wide it frightened people who preferred fences and certainty, and he had been clear from the beginning. He didn't need heirs, didn't want children, didn't care about her condition. "I need help," he had said simply, "and I need quiet." That sentence alone made her father's shoulders loosen, because quiet women were easier to sell, and so the deal was struck not with celebration but relief, a transaction disguised as mercy. Mara left her home at dawn without ceremony, carrying a single bag and a lifetime of unspoken goodbyes, not because she loved the place, but because it had taught her what abandonment felt like, and she suspected she would recognize it anywhere. The ranch was nothing like she imagined. There were no grand buildings, only a sturdy house worn smooth by time, fences that leaned but held, animals that watched her with calm curiosity, and beyond it all, land that stretched like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. The widower, Elias, stood waiting when the wagon arrived, his eyes sharp but tired, his face marked by lines that spoke of years spent speaking more to animals than people, and when he looked at her there was no hunger. No judgment, no disappointment, only assessment, the same way he might look at the sky before deciding whether to trust the weather. He didn't ask about her past, didn't comment on her condition, didn't offer pity or reassurance, only took her bag and said, "You can rest today. Work starts tomorrow." That was it. No vows, no speeches, no expectations beyond the next sunrise. In the days that followed, Mara learned the rhythm of the ranch and the rhythm of Elias, who spoke little but watched much, who woke before dawn and slept only when the stars demanded it, who carried grief like a private language he never translated. He never touched her unless necessary, never raised his voice, never asked for more than she gave freely, and that frightened her more than cruelty ever had, because kindness without demand felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. At night, alone in a clean bed with walls that didn't whisper her failures back to her, Mara lay awake listening to the wind and wondering when the price of her barrenness would finally be collected, because surely no transaction ended without cost. Slowly, almost against her will, she noticed small mercies. Food placed aside for her before she could ask, tools sized to fit her hands, instructions given once and trusted to be remembered. Elias treated her not as a defect, but as a presence, and in that space something inside her, long compressed and hidden, began to ache. She worked harder than required, not to earn affection, but to justify her existence, and Elias noticed but said nothing. Only one evening remarking, "You don't have to disappear to belong here." The words struck deeper than any insult she had ever endured, because no one had ever accused her of disappearing before. They had simply expected it. Weeks turned into months, and the ranch became less a place of exile and more a place of reckoning, where silence wasn't punishment but peace, and where Mara began to realize that being unwanted by her family did not mean she was unworthy of being chosen. Yet even as trust grew, fear lingered like an old wound. because she had learned that acceptance was often temporary, conditional, fragile, and she wondered what would happen when Elias finally saw her not as help, not as convenience, but as a woman marked by what she could never give. And it was on a night heavy with rain, when thunder shook the land and memories pressed too close, that Mara finally asked the question she had been carrying since the day she was sold, her voice barely steady as she stood in the doorway and said, "Why did you choose me?" Elias looked at her for a long moment, rain drumming against the roof like a heartbeat, and when he answered, his voice was quiet but unshakable. "Because everyone deserves a place where they're not measured by what they lack." And in that moment, something shifted, not just in her understanding of him, but in her understanding of herself. If this story already speaks to you, if you feel the weight of being judged by labels you never chose, stay with us because this is only the beginning. And stories like this, stories about dignity, healing, and quiet strength, deserve to be heard, shared, and remembered. And subscribing ensures you never miss the ones that remind you that worth is not inherited. It is claimed. The night Elias spoke those words did not erase Mara's fears, but it rearranged them like furniture shifted just enough to let light enter a room that had been dark for years. And from that night on, she stopped waiting for the moment she would be exposed as insufficient and began, slowly and cautiously, to live as though her presence itself had value. Seasons passed across the ranch with a patience that taught her more than sermons ever could, and as the land changed, so did the silences between her and Elias, no longer weighted with distance but with understanding, a shared language built from glances, small gestures, and the steady work of days lived honestly. Elias never spoke much of his late wife, but grief lingered in the way he paused before entering certain rooms, in the way he avoided the old oak near the pasture. And Mara learned not to fill those spaces with questions but with consistency, showing up every day in ways that did not demand gratitude. Over time, he began to trust her not just with the ranch but with himself, letting stories surface in fragments, how his wife had loved fiercely, how her death had hollowed him, how the expectation of children had once felt like a promise and then like a threat when the world reminded him that even promises could be taken. Mara listened without trying to fix him, because she knew what it was like to be treated as something broken that needed repair rather than something human that needed understanding. It was during one such conversation, sitting beneath the open sky after a long day, that she finally spoke of her own wound, not the rumor of barrenness passed down by others, but the deeper injury of being reduced to it, of being sold not because she was unwanted, but because she was deemed useless. Elias did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes or anger on her behalf, only said they were wrong, with a certainty that startled her, and in that moment she realized she was being seen without, conditioned for the first time in her life. But healing is rarely linear, and word of her life on the ranch eventually reached the village, carried by rumor and resentment. And when her family arrived unannounced one afternoon, their presence felt like a storm rolling over land that had just begun to heal. They spoke loudly, demanded explanations, accused Elias of taking advantage of what they had discarded, and reminded Mara, publicly, cruelly, of the label they had placed upon her, expecting her to shrink under it as she always had. Instead, something unexpected happened. Elias stepped forward, not with anger but with quiet authority, and said the words that would echo through Mara's life long after the dust settled. "I didn't take her. You gave her away because you couldn't see her worth. I didn't need children. I needed her." Silence followed, thick and absolute, and for the first time, Mara saw her family not as judges but as strangers bound by fear and limitation, unable to understand a life not built on transaction. When they left, diminished and empty-handed, Mara felt grief, not for their absence, but for the years she had spent believing their verdict defined her. In the weeks that followed, she expected the moment to fracture something between her and Elias, but instead it deepened what already existed. Trust transforming into devotion, not born of obligation, but of choice. Their bond grew quietly, without ceremony, until one evening Elias said simply, "This is your home, whether you stay or go." And Mara realized that love, real love, did not cage. It offered ground solid enough to stand on freely. When sickness later threatened her life, when doctors spoke again of her body in terms of failure and limitation, Elias sat by her bed and held her hand not as a savior but as a partner, reminding her that her worth had never been tied to what she could produce, only to who she was. She recovered, not miraculously but steadily, and when life resumed its rhythm, it carried a new understanding. Families can fail you. Labels can lie, and sometimes the place you are sent to be forgotten becomes the place where you are finally found. Years later, when travelers passed through the ranch and asked about their life, Elias would answer with a smile that surprised those who remembered him as a broken Vidova. And Mara would stand beside him not as a woman once sold, but as a woman chosen, not because she fulfilled an expectation, but because she was enough. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that your value is not defined by others, limits, or by roles you were told you must fulfill, then stay with us, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this exist to remind us all that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about what we give the world, but about who we are when someone finally says, "I don't need what you can offer. I need you."